have a very, very tender spot for this movie. It's very hard to look like you're having a fun time when you're like,
What if I told you that the most iconic dance movie of all time almost never made it to a single movie screen? What if The Lift, The Lake, the line "Nobody puts baby in a corner" almost didn't exist because a studio executive wanted to burn the film reel and cash the insurance check instead? Stick around, because today we're diving into the scenes, secrets, and near disasters behind Dirty Dancing that most fans have never heard of, and by the end of this video, you'll never watch that Lake Lift the same way again. Nearly 4 decades later, Dirty Dancing is still one of those movies people quote without even thinking about it. It made Patrick Swayze a household name, turned Jennifer Grey into the girl every teenager wanted to be, and gave us a soundtrack that still fills up dance floors at weddings. But here's the thing almost nobody talks about. This movie came within inches of never existing at all, and the version we know and love today looked completely different at several points during production. So let's start at the very beginning, with a problem most people don't even realize the film had before a single frame was shot. Believe it or not, the name Dirty Dancing itself nearly sank the entire project. Back in the late 1980s, censors and border officials were far more sensitive to anything that sounded remotely suggestive, and when the film's dailies crossed into Canada, officials reportedly held them up because they assumed, based on the title alone, that they were dealing with an adult film. Screenwriter Eleanor Bergstein, who based much of the story on her own teenage experiences, later explained that authorities genuinely thought the title signaled something far raunchier than a coming-of-age romance. The studio stood firm on keeping the name, but not everyone on set was thrilled about it. Patrick Swayze himself reportedly despised the title and pushed to have it changed, saying in an interview around the film's release that he wished it had been called something else entirely. Considering one of the alternate titles floating around at the time was apparently something close to "I Was a Teenage Mambo Queen," maybe audiences should be thanking the marketing team for sticking to their guns. Now here's where things get really interesting, because the Johnny Castle we know from the movie almost wasn't Patrick Swayze at all. Several other actors were floated for the role before he landed it, including names like Billy Zane, Benicio del Toro, and Val Kilmer. In fact, filming had actually begun with a different actor set to play Johnny before producers realized there was zero spark between him and Jennifer Grey on camera, forcing a last-minute recasting. Patrick's background as a trained dancer, having studied at prestigious ballet schools, made him a much stronger fit once producers pivoted, especially since the director reportedly wanted performers who could dance for real rather than relying on stand-ins for every big number. Jennifer Grey's casting had its own drama too. Before she was locked in as Baby, other well-known actresses of the era, including Sarah Jessica Parker and Winona Ryder, read for the part. Grey ended up being paid a relatively modest fee for a role that would go on to define her career, and unlike her co-star, she wasn't a trained dancer at all. She's spoken candidly in later interviews about how intimidating it was to partner with someone as fearless and skilled as Swayze, describing their dynamic as almost a marriage of opposites, where he'd throw himself into anything and she'd freeze up with nerves. And speaking of that dynamic, here's something that might surprise you. The on-screen chemistry between Johnny and Baby wasn't exactly mirrored behind the scenes. Swayze and Grey had actually worked together once before, on the 1984 film Red Dawn, and according to people close to the production, tension between them started well before Dirty Dancing ever went into pre-production. Once they were cast opposite each other again, that friction didn't magically disappear. Swayze wrote in his memoir, released years later, that Grey could be emotionally volatile on set, sometimes breaking down in tears if she felt criticized, and other times dissolving into fits of laughter that forced them to reshoot scenes over and over. Choreographer Kenny Ortega, who worked closely with both of them, later described their relationship as a constant push and pull, some days full of conflict, other days full of warmth, calling them something like human fireworks. To get them back on the same page before filming, the production reportedly had them re-watch their original Chemistry Red audition, just to remind them how naturally they had once played off each other. That off-screen friction, strangely enough, might be exactly what gave us one of the most beloved scenes in the entire movie, and it happened completely by accident. During the rehearsal montage where Johnny and Baby practice the mambo, there's a moment where he runs his fingers down her arm and she dissolves into giggles while his frustration visibly builds. That entire moment was unplanned. Grey was genuinely, uncontrollably ticklish, and Swayze's irritation in that scene was real irritation, not acting. The crew actually shot a second, more composed take afterward for the final cut and more or less forgot the giggly version even existed. It wasn't until editors were combing through footage later that they rediscovered it, and once producer Linda Gottlieb saw it, She reportedly burst out laughing and knew immediately it had to make the final film. When they showed it to Swayze and Gray, both of them cracked up too, half because it was charming and half because neither of them remembered filming it in the first place. There's another spontaneous moment tucked into the film that most casual fans never clock as unscripted: the playful dance to Love Is Strange. That entire sequence wasn't planned as a formal scene at all. The actors thought they were simply rehearsing off camera, unaware that the crew was rolling, which is part of why it feels so loose and real compared to the more choreographed numbers elsewhere in the film. That kind of raw, caught-on-camera authenticity is incredibly hard to fake, and it's a big part of why that scene still holds up decades later. Now let's talk about the conditions these actors were actually working in, because grueling doesn't even begin to cover it. Filming ran for a tight 43 days starting in early September of 1986, and the crew was dealing with brutal heat. Outdoor temperatures were pushing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and once you added studio lighting and camera equipment into the mix indoors, temperatures reportedly spiked to something like 120 degrees. Choreographer Kenny Ortega has talked about one especially rough day where roughly 10 people fainted within a span of 25 minutes. Veteran actress Paula Truman, who played Mrs. Schumacher, actually collapsed from dehydration and had to be rushed to a local hospital. Swayze himself, who insisted on doing his own stunts, injured his knee multiple times falling off a log during the balancing scenes, to the point where fluid had to be drained from the swelling just so he could keep working. Ironically, all of that scorching heat was happening while the film was supposedly set in a picture-perfect summer at a lakeside resort, and by the time production hit its later stages, the calendar had actually flipped into fall. That created a whole new problem for the crew. How do you sell summer when the leaves are turning and the grass is dying? Their solution was refreshingly low-tech. Crew members physically spray-painted grass and foliage green to fake a summer look for the cameras. But paint couldn't fix everything, and the most brutal example of that was the lake. The iconic swimming and lift sequence was actually filmed in October, when the water temperature had dropped to somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Gray has since admitted the water was miserably, painfully cold, and that she basically pushed through it because she was young, ambitious, and desperate to make the moment work. Swayze described the same lake in equally unflattering terms in his memoir, calling it hyperthermically cold, and noting that they had to repeat the scene multiple times to get it right. Gray later revealed in her own memoir that the two of them deliberately saved that specific lift for the very end of filming, wanting to make sure they nailed it when it counted most, and she's written that the trust and respect audiences see between Johnny and Baby in that moment was completely genuine, born out of everything they'd pushed through together to get there. Speaking of Swayze pushing through pain, here's a detail that puts his entire performance in a completely different light. Most audiences have no idea that Swayze was dancing through this entire film on a severely damaged knee, an injury that dated all the way back to a high school football accident. To rebuild strength in his leg afterward, he'd actually turned to dance in the first place, eventually becoming a principal dancer with a respected ballet company. But a few years before Dirty Dancing, a tooth infection spiraled into a serious staph infection that settled directly in that same damaged leg, and doctors reportedly warned him at the time that amputation was a real possibility if it wasn't treated aggressively. He survived it, but the damage lingered for the rest of his life. By the time he was filming Dirty Dancing, so much cartilage in his knee had worn away that the bones were essentially grinding against each other with every lift and every landing. He's talked about how lifting someone in water, even someone as light as Gray, felt like hauling 500 pounds once you accounted for the resistance and the strain on an already damaged joint. Every time you re-watch that lake lift now, keep in mind that the guy making it look effortless was doing it in genuine, constant pain, on a knee that was quite literally falling apart. And here's the part of the story that might shock you the most: this movie almost never came out at all, regardless of any of the on-set drama. The script had reportedly been turned down more than 40 times before a smaller studio finally agreed to take a chance on it with a modest budget in the single-digit millions. Even after filming wrapped on schedule and on budget in late October of 1986, the finished rough cut tested so poorly with early audiences that studio executives were reportedly ready to shelve it entirely. One producer involved with the film has recounted a particularly brutal moment where a producer watching an early screening suggested they should just destroy the negative and collect the insurance money rather than release it. A striking number of test audience members apparently didn't even register that the storyline involved a serious subplot around abortion, which shows just how much the tone and pacing was struggling in that early version. On top of that, a planned sponsorship deal with a well-known skincare brand fell apart when the company objected to that same subplot and demanded it be cut. And when the filmmakers refused, the studio lost a significant marketing partner and had to figure out promotion largely on its own. Given all of that, the studio didn't even plan for a wide theatrical run. The initial strategy was to release it in theaters for a short window and then push it quickly into home video, which was actually where the distributor had more experience and confidence. Nobody, not the studio, not the producers, not the cast, walked into that premiere in August of 1987 expecting a cultural phenomenon. And yet that's exactly what happened. The film went on to gross well over $200 million worldwide against its tiny original budget, and it even won an Academy Award for Best Original Song for I've Had the Time of My Life. One of the producers has since reflected on just how close the film came to being dismissed as forgettable, pointing out how strange it feels now, knowing that some of the very people who worked on it were once convinced it would flop. There's one more thread to this story that fans still bring up constantly, and that's what happened to Jennifer Grey after Dirty Dancing turned her into a star. In the years following the film's release, she made the decision to get a nose job, a choice that ended up needing a corrective second surgery after complications. The results changed her appearance so significantly that even close friends reportedly had trouble recognizing her at first. Grey has spoken with a lot of honesty about how disorienting that period was for her, describing it almost like living through a strange kind of loss, where she became more conventionally attractive by industry standards but felt like it unraveled the identity and career she had spent years building. She said the experience was genuinely one of the most defining, difficult chapters of her life, and she eventually wrote about it at length in her memoir, reflecting on how a decision meant to refine her image ended up disrupting the momentum she had worked so hard to earn. It's a reminder that even people who seem to have it all after a breakout role can face very real personal struggles once the cameras stop rolling. So where does all of this leave the franchise today? Fans have been asking for years why a movie this beloved never got a proper sequel, and there has been real movement on that front. Jennifer Grey has been attached to executive produce and star in a new Dirty Dancing project, reportedly reprising her role as Baby decades after the original story. She's spoken about being drawn to the idea of revisiting the character years later, exploring what that journey looks like with the passage of time built into the story itself. Production timelines have shifted more than once, partly due to industry-wide disruptions like the recent SAG-AFTRA strike, pushing the release further back than originally planned. Since Patrick Swayze is no longer with us, any new installment obviously can't recast Johnny Castle in the traditional sense, and reports suggest the filmmakers are choosing instead to honor his character within the story rather than replace him outright. Swayze's widow has publicly expressed some hesitation about the project, noting that he had turned down sequel ideas himself while he was alive because he felt the original film's ending didn't need anything added to it. That sentiment seems to be shared by a good chunk of longtime fans too, plenty of whom feel the story wrapped up exactly the way it should have, while plenty of others are genuinely excited to see Baby's world expanded.